This month, the foundation that we have been preaching on, or I guess I should say, George has been preaching on, I think I have one lesson out of the whole thing, has been the church. Next month, we are going to shift that to a relationship that we have with one another. And so this morning's lesson is kind of a bridge to that, if you will. It will take what we've said about the relationship that we have as people to God and bridge that as we have relationships with one another and how we look at that. And so that's what this lesson is about. Don't have a PowerPoint this morning. Technical things sometimes work, sometimes they don't. And so this time they didn't. Somehow emails don't always get to where they're going. It's in cyberspace somewhere. I think it will probably catch up with Dana next week. But nonetheless, we're going to do this old-fashioned way this morning, just point by point. And I'll try to be clear where I'm going. We are really blessed in so many ways to be people of God. I think we all would acknowledge that. God's grace, His boundless love, His willingness to give His Son on the cross for us, His willingness to reveal His mind to us so that we can have it to read. All those things are blessings that are indescribable. There's not words to put to how rich those blessings are. But there's also an additional blessing. And that is that God has given us one another. God in His wisdom determined that brethren would need one another in what He would call a fellowship of His people. And we find those sprinkled throughout the New Testament in different localities. And so there's a bringing of people together under common oversight who pool their resources, agreeing to work together as one. And we call that a local church. A local church comprised of people who've been saved by God, but that share a relationship with each other. And that relationship that we should have with each other should be rich and should be deep and should be treasured. In the New Testament, there's a statement that appears in Acts chapter 4 and verse 32 that says they were of one heart, one soul, and one mind. One heart, one soul, and one mind. But how did that happen? How did they come to be that? Did God leave us without help to understand exactly how we could accomplish that? And what is my part in that? If you saw the title to the lesson, maybe you saw it on the PowerPoint ahead, the title is Who's Right, Who's Wrong, Who's to Blame. Put a peg there. We'll play that out in just a little while. But that would be the title, the way I've entitled this lesson. But back to the point. How do we accomplish that one heart, one soul, and one mind? Well, let me ask it this way. If you're married and you stood before whoever officiated at your wedding, and at the end the pronouncement was made, and the two shall be one, how does that happen? How is it that two can become one? And have you noticed how funny God's math is? How 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, but 1 plus 1 equals 1? And 380 plus 1 still equals 1? It doesn't equal 381? You ever notice that? But how is it that a husband and wife, two individuals, can be one? I don't think he's talking about some kind of physical interaction together there. I think what he's talking about is that there's one aim and there's one purpose. At any given time in a husband-wife relationship, under the nicest description, we would say that there are discussions. There may be disagreements. There may be things that don't go the way one wishes the other that it would go. But you don't throw it away because you have one aim and one purpose, one heart, one soul, and one mind. So what did God give us that can help us accomplish that? And did what God give us, is it useful for us, and are we able to use it to accomplish that one heart, one soul, and one mind? Or is it an impossible expectation? Is it just the impossible dream? Well, the first thing I would suggest that God has given us in order to accomplish that is He has given us, number one, mutual care. Mutual care. If you'd like to turn in the Bible with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, I want you to see this in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6, you have a situation in which there are brethren in the church at Corinth that are having problems with one another. And they're taking those problems and they're airing them before the public, generally. And Moses is correcting that. Paul is correcting that. But come down to 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 7 and verse 8. Now, therefore, is already an utter failure for you that if you go to law against one another, why do you not accept rather the wrong? Why do you not rather let yourself be cheated? No, you yourselves do wrong and cheat, and you do these things to cheat your brethren. Here is a forgotten commandment. What Paul is saying is, why don't you take the wrong? Why don't you have enough mutual care for your brother, instead of airing this before the general public? Why don't you, rather than cheat somebody else, cheat yourself and you take the wrong? Even if the taking that wrong requires of you or me some sacrifice. For example, in Acts chapter 4 again, from verse 32, we pull that excerpt of one heart, one soul, and one mind. But if you follow on down through verse 34 in that reading, the thing that brought them together with one heart, one soul, and one mind was there was a common need that was there. There were some saints among them there that had a need. And how did they satisfy that need? Everyone sacrificed to give something so that those in need could have that need supplied. They brought all the things they had. Some sold gifts, or sold their land, some gave gifts. And they brought that money and put it at the feet of the apostles, and the apostle distributed that to everyone among them who had need that were believers. They sacrificed for one another. Instead of saying, well, you're just going to have to find a way to work yourself out of that. Because they had one heart, one soul, and one mind, they were willing to sacrifice even the ownership of their property to supply the need that their brethren had. And so are we willing to supply that need by sacrificing ourselves even to the point that it may require that I take the wrong in doing so? And what if it's somebody that I have a disagreement with? What if it's somebody that may lend toward that category of an enemy? Am I willing to sacrifice for their good? Am I willing to speak well of them? Am I willing to pray for them? Am I willing to do good for them? Mutual care. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 11, there's something to put right beside that idea of mutual care, I think, that helps us accomplish this. Notice he will say, therefore, comfort each other and edify one another, just as you are also doing. Comfort and edify. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, look at verses 3 and 4. And listen how follow the flow of what Paul gives here. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and Father of mercies, and God of all comfort. Now, in 1 Thessalonians, Paul said, comfort one another. Here he says, God be blessed, the God of all comfort, notice, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. Notice Paul says we have been comforted, and we take that comfort we have received and we comfort somebody else. How are the apostles comforted? Well, the Lord is telling them, I'm going to go away. And where I go, you cannot come. Well, how come we can't come? Well, you just can't go. You're not ready for this. However, I'm not going to leave you all alone here. I'm going to send a comforter to you. And that comforter is going to be there with you. He's going to give you words to speak. He's going to teach you further things, and he's going to put you in remembrance of all things I've taught you. He's going to be your comforter. He's going to be the one that will be the advocate for you. And Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 11, you be an advocate for one another. Have mutual care to be an advocate for each other. And in so doing, you edify one another. That word edify, you know, is the word build up, to strengthen. Paul will pray in Ephesians chapter 3, that second prayer, beginning of verse 14, that we might be strengthened mightily in the inner man, that God will strengthen us in the inner man. Here Paul is saying, you take that same word, be strengthened or comforted. Here you need someone that will be an ally, be an advocate for you so that what? They can build you up. Here are God's words that are given to the apostles, and they write those words down, and these are words of brilliance. These are words that are from the mind of God. And here is God's mind telling us how we can be of mutual care and comfort and therefore build each other up. The first thing we need to think about when we think about building each other up is we need to think about having one heart, one soul and mind, because we have such a mutual care. We will take the wrong and sacrifice ourselves, even if it's somebody with whom I disagree, so that I may comfort and build them up. Because it's not about me. And it's not about you. It's about us serving Him. The second thing I would give is the word compassion. The word compassion. That word compassion is an interesting word to break down. The word com, that first part, com, means with. Passion means feeler. And the emphasis is on the with, not the feeler. It is with feeling. It's not with feeling. It's with feeling. We are a feeler with one another. And so Paul says, you have compassion. You be with feeler. You feel with another. I remember reading the story after the war in Europe, when everything had been decimated, bombs and everything, Germany was flattened, everything was in rubbles. There was this young boy who was an orphan, whose parents had been killed, left all alone, young boy. Had no food, had no one to care for him. Sometime in his recent past, he'd heard something about God and Jesus, but because of all the turmoil and everything that was there, he'd forgotten all about that. Well, he was standing outside a bread store and just smelling the bread. That smell just going through, and he just smelling that and just taking that in. And this soldier walked up. And the young boy didn't see the soldier, but the soldier saw the young boy looking in that window. So the soldier went in and came out and had a big bag with him. And he looked at that young boy and said, "Here, son, you take this." And the boy looked in that bag, and it was some of that bread. And the little boy looked up at him and said, "Sir, are you Jesus?" You see, there was with feeling. We are never more like God than when we have with feeling. Have you ever thought that God not only did not leave the apostles alone, He'd not leave us alone? As good a man as Cornelius was, God remembered Cornelius. God made atonement possible for you and me. He made reconciliation possible for you and me. He did not leave us alone. It was with feeling, that He sent His Son for us. That was the ultimate act of compassion. In Hebrews 10, verse 24, he says to stir up one another for love and good works. Sometimes that word stir can be used negatively, sometimes it can be used positively, and obviously here it is used positively. You stir up one another to love and good works. That means if we're going to stir each other up for love and good works, then therefore we must have a relationship with one another. That means there must be some interaction with one another. That means we must be with feeling with others. But there's a risk in that. When you seek to strive to put yourself involved in the lives of other people, sometimes you take on their pain and sometimes you take on their problems, and sometimes we take on the risk of being rejected. There is a great risk to being a stir person. There's a great risk to be a with feeler, and that with feeling might be rejected. You might be hurt. And you know what? God took that risk. It was with feeling. He gave His Son. It was with compassion that He gave His Son. And He put it all out there. He offered the risk. And you know what? There were some that rejected Him. But He didn't pull back His compassion. He still offers Himself to be involved in each one of our lives so that we can have a relationship with Him. He took that risk. And we take that risk to be compassionate with one another. The third thing, as we turn to Ephesians chapter 3, is the word forbear. Ephesians chapter 3. Ephesians chapter 3, look at what he will say in this opening section here. Chapter 4, verse 3. Verse 1 says, I therefore, the prisoner of the Lord, beseech you to walk worthy of the calling with which you were called, with all lowliness and gentleness, with long suffering, notice, bearing with one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. You see, Paul says, in order to keep the unity of the Spirit, there's an attitude that must precede it. And that attitude that precedes it is missing. Then you'll not have that unity in the Spirit that is a byproduct of the bond of peace. And notice what he said precedes that. You've been called by lowliness, gentleness, with long suffering, bearing with one another, what? In love. Forbearing, bearing with one another. Having that attitude there is the key to having one heart, one soul, and one mind. Bearing with one another. Being a with bearer, we would say. How? In love. That is, my love for you and your love for me enables me to forbear you. In any given relationship that involves more than one person, it involves people who have differences. There's a great diversity in a local church. It is not homogeneous. Different races, different educational backgrounds, different familial experiences, different life experiences, different financial status. But there's one thing in common. We all share a common need. And that common need is we all need a Savior. But we bring to that table our personalities, our personality quirks, our idiosyncrasies. The things that make us all different also make us the same. And we bring those to the table. And sometimes those kinds of things are kind of like sandpaper. They just kind of grate, they just kind of rub. And sometimes the sandpaper is a little more gritty. Sometimes the sandpaper is a little smoother. And sometimes that gritty sandpaper just rubs a little bit more raw, and sometimes that smooth sandpaper just kind of finishes off. But with both, it takes forbearing one another. That means if I love you enough and you love me enough, then what we can do is we can bear with one another in love. But as we do that, Paul will say in Colossians chapter 3, beginning in verse 12, something similar to what he just said, but listen to how he says this. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering. Notice, bearing with one another, forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ also forgave you, so you also must do. Circle that phrase, bearing with one another, and just read that. Therefore, bearing with one another, even as Christ forbore you, so you must do also. Notice, here Paul says, here are how the elect of God behave. Here is the attitude the elect of God have toward one another. And notice he puts that in the form of an injunction. That injunction is as powerful as he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. What he's saying is it's not optional. If I want to be right with God, to have a relationship with God, I don't have the option. I don't have the option other than to what? Than to put on tender mercies, be kind, be humble, be meek, long-suffering, and bear with one another, forgiving one another. Even if someone has a complaint, as Christ forgave, so I also must forgive. But I don't do that perfectly. Sometimes those rubs happen. Sometimes those interactions take place. And those idiosyncrasies, those quirks that make us different, magnify themselves as opposed to staying minimal. And what is minimized is the bearing with one another. So here's what I want to ask. When mutual care and compassion and forbearing with one another is missing, who's right, who's wrong, and who's to blame? You know, among those personality types and those differences, sometimes you'll have someone that is effervescent. I mean, they're just bubbly, they're filled with life. In fact, young people are a lot that way. If you were here Wednesday night, I tell you, you could not help but just catch the enthusiasm of Joshua. I mean, he was just as enthusiastic as he could be up here, giving us that little invitation. It was marvelous, and I just loved not just his message, but his enthusiasm with all that. He was effervescent about that. He was bubbling about that. On the other hand, sometimes you have people that are quiet, and sometimes you have people that are timid, and sometimes you have people that are viewed, right or wrong, as maybe being a little crotchety. And seldom are young people characterized that way. Most of the time, it's the older people that are characterized that way. Some of you have young people say, well, they may be quiet, but you don't say, well, they're just crotchety. They're just an old crotchety old man. You'll say that about young people. And so you have those that are effervescent and idealistic, and that's awesome in their idealism, and their view of life is tremendous. And then you have those who have those life experiences, and they've been affected by those life experiences, and those life experiences sometimes haven't been the best of life experiences, and it makes them a little crotchety. And so then what one says about the other is, here's how it happens. The young people will look at the old people and say, how come they are all so judgmental? Wait. Where's the mutual care? Where's the compassion? Where's the forbearance? Who's right? Who's wrong? Who's to blame? But then you have those old people. Those old crotchety people, they're kind of quiet and kind of timid until they're old and crotchety, and then they then are judgmental of young people. Because after all, we all know about young people. We all know about all these teenagers. We know all the mistakes these teenagers are going to make. We know let me just preach to you about how bad these teenagers are going to be, and one day if they live long enough, they'll get over it. Let me tell you how bad these young people are. Let me tell you how bad these teenagers are. Let me tell you how bad these college students are. They just think they know everything. Let me just tell you how bad they are. Wait. Where's the mutual care? Where's the compassion? Where's the forbearance? Who's right? Who's wrong? And who's to blame? And here's someone I disagree with. We're not talking about things that equate to sin. We're talking about things that fit in the realm of opinion, the realm of judgment, the realm of personality, the realm of quirks, the realm of idiosyncrasies. Here's someone that I have a disagreement with the way I look at things, the way I look at life, the way I look at a particular passage, the way I look at a particular thing a local church might do. Here's just something with which, from my familial experiences, from my age, from my vantage point, I just see things a little bit different than somebody else. How do I see that person? Do I see that person in a suspicious way? Do I discount, diminish that person as being of no value, no consideration whatsoever? It's interesting to me that John will say in 1 John chapter 2 and also 1 John chapter 3 that if you hate your brother, you walk in darkness and have not God, because God is love and God is light, and he that loveth his brother will be like God. God is love. If you hate your brother, that word hate there is despise. It is to value as nothing. Your brother, he says, you have the heart of a murderer. Would anyone here want to be characterized by God as having that kind of heart? Because here's someone that I disagree with, young or old, and I have that kind of disposition of spite toward that person because I'm missing mutual care, compassion, and forbearance. And John said, when we have that kind of attitude, we don't have the heart of God. We have the same kind of heart a murderer has when he murders. Would any of us want to be before the throne of God and be found guilty of murdering one of our brethren because we held them of such little value, we held them in despite and derision? You know what else we have in common? You and I were bought with the same price, the same blood. And you know how you value something? It's by the price you pay. Christ gave his blood for you, and Christ gave his blood for me. If he gave his blood for each one of us, then isn't the least that we can do is have mutual care and compassion and forbearance with one another? Has what the Lord spoken of here, has what Paul spoken of here, is it an impossibility for people who are collected together like this? Is it impossible for a family to be like that? Are these just words on a piece of paper to enamor us? So a preacher has something to get up and speak about, or a Bible class teacher has something to get up and talk about? These were words that were written because this is what God wanted his people to be and the attitude he wanted his people to have. However, if I don't spend enough time to comfort, invest in enough with feeling, and am too selfish to only see the bearance of my problems, not forbearing others, then I want to ask each one of us, whose spirit is going to reign in us? I think we all know it's not going to be God. So I'm going to ask the question one more time. Who's right? And who's wrong? And who's to blame? And here's the answer. I am. I am. I'm the one that's wrong. I'm the one that's to blame. Because somewhere along the line, I did not take the wrong. Somewhere along the line, I was not willing to sacrifice. And somewhere along the line, I was not willing to speak well of, do good for, and pray for, and be a with-feeler with somebody else that would enable me to be forbearing with one another. I was wrong. I'm to blame. My whole appeal to this is, I don't care what the age you are. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with me. But I don't care what age you are. There are a lot of things right with you and a lot of things right with me. And instead of magnifying the things that diminish, why don't we amplify the things that make us more like God? To have that mutual care and compassion and forbearance with one another. I'll tell you what I can't imagine. I can't imagine a congregation without the number of young people we have. However, I have preached in congregations without the number of young people we have. I'll tell you something else I can't imagine. I can't imagine a congregation of people without the older people that we have. And I've never preached in a congregation without the older people that we have. And you know what the older people need? They need the younger people. You know what the younger people need? They need the older people. And you know what none of us need? Someone who's not going to have mutual care, lacking compassion, and be unwilling to forbear. I don't need that, and you don't need that. And all I want to ask us to do, this isn't about pointing fingers at anybody except for Ricky. I just want to ask each one of us, not when we walk in the door, but when we rise from that watery grave of baptism and transformation takes place, that we let the old man stay buried and all the spirit that goes with him. And let that new heart and that new mind to be continually transformed to where we look more like the Lord. And when you look more like the Lord and I look more like the Lord, we look the same. You see, the church is people of belonging to Christ, who struggle with and fight an adversary in this world that is seeking to destroy us and to divide us and to conquer us. Is it my place to be the local church cop? Is it my place to be the social media policeman? If something's not said just like I want it said, if something's not posted that is just a little bit different in a post, am I the one that has to correct that, or can I have mutual care, compassion, and forbearance to allow that person or persons to express themselves as I want the privilege to be able to express myself? You see, if I have mutual care, compassion, and forbearance with you, and you have the same with me, and I say something just a little bit different than you would say it, and we're out to be on social media, and I post it just a little bit different than you would post it, am I the one that has to correct it and retaliate with it, or can I just say, you know, I'm just going to have mutual care with that person, I'm going to be compassionate with that person, and I'm going to forbear with them because they are my brother, they are my sister. And so instead of being gritty sandpaper that rubs raw, I'm going to let the finishing of the potter, mixing metaphors here, I'm going to let the finishing of the potter put the finishing touches on them and on me. And I've got a lot of finishing that needs to be done. If there's something this morning that we can do in any possible way to help anyone, because we care, And we want to feel with you. And we want to help you by forbearing with you. If we can help you in any way, listen. Come. Let us know. We'll pray for you. Won't you come while we stand up, while we sing?